Earth's refusal to embrace killing wasn't weakness. It became its ultimate survival strategy when facing annihilation. That supposed flaw, sending a medic instead of a soldier, changed how the galaxy understands strength itself. Sometimes the most powerful move is refusing to fight at all, turning conflict into collaboration through uncompromising care. That's the lesson entire civilizations won't forget. So next time you see a dispute escalating somewhere, just consider, what if someone asked for a medic instead of more weapons? You might be surprised how often helping is stronger than harming. You know how diplomats usually come from political science backgrounds or aristocratic families with generations of government service? Danny came from an emergency medicine background with exactly one uniform that still had a stain from someone's arterial bleed. His unexpected success with the Vexar situation led to an appointment that made protocol officers visibly uncomfortable. Interspecies medical liaison, a position that hadn't existed until someone had to create it just for him. The diplomatic corps, accustomed to carefully crafted statements and formal receptions, now had to accommodate a medic who carried a diagnostic scanner. Instead of briefing documents and treated summit, meetings like extended patient consultations. Protocol, officers struggled daily with his medically focused approach to diplomacy. Where traditional diplomats would analyze political motivations and historical contexts, Danny analyzed cortisol levels and nutritional deficiencies. He'd arrive at negotiations with medical scanners instead of position papers, often beginning meetings by checking delegates' vital signs and making recommendations about their sleep cycles or dietary habits. He argued that sleep-deprived leaders made poor decisions and that low blood sugar caused unnecessary aggression during tense negotiations. This approach left career diplomats bewildered, watching as their carefully prepared talking points were interrupted by medical assessments. He treated diplomatic tensions like symptoms of underlying conditions that needed diagnosis and treatment, rather than political challenges that needed strategizing. A trade dispute wasn't about tariffs or regulations. It was a symptom of resource scarcity that required medical-grade nutritional supplementation programs. Border conflicts stemmed from population density issues that could be addressed through public health initiatives rather than military deployments. His meetings involved more vital signs checks than policy discussions, with delegates finding themselves having their blood pressure monitored while discussing interstellar treaties. He maintained that healthy civilizations don't start wars, they diagnose and treat their problems before they escalate into conflict. This perspective turned traditional diplomacy upside down. Instead of negotiating from positions of strength, he worked from principles of wellness. Where other diplomats might threaten economic sanctions or military action, he'd propose joint medical research initiatives or cross-species health monitoring programs. The approach was so fundamentally different that it often disarmed tense situations before they could escalate into actual conflicts. Traditional diplomats found his methods unorthodox but couldn't dispute their effectiveness. They watched as stubborn negotiations that had lasted for years suddenly progressed when Danny started treating them like medical cases rather than political disputes. Opposition delegates who had refused to compromise for decades found themselves agreeing to reasonable terms after he'd addressed their chronic back pain or sleep apnea issues. The medical approach created common ground where political maneuvering had consistently failed. The medic became the most effective diplomat in recent galactic history precisely because he didn't act like a diplomat at all. His success rate at resolving long-standing conflicts exceeded that of career negotiators who'd spent lifetimes studying interstellar relations. His appointment, initially viewed as a temporary experiment, became permanent when the results proved too valuable to ignore. The diplomatic corps found itself integrating medical professionals into all negotiation teams, creating a hybrid approach that combined traditional diplomacy with health-focused interventions. His approach created an entirely new template for future interspecies relations. Diplomatic missions now included medical assessment teams that evaluated the physiological state of negotiating partners. Treaty discussions began with health scans and wellness evaluations. The very language of diplomacy incorporated medical terminology, with phrases like diagnosing the core issue and treating the symptoms of conflict becoming standard negotiation vocabulary. The galaxy had discovered that sometimes the most effective diplomat wasn't someone who understood politics, but someone who understood people's basic health needs and that realization would shape interstellar relations for generations to come. So years after the ceasefire, Second Chance Station evolved beyond its original medical purpose to become something much larger, a living symbol that what had been the galaxy's bloodiest conflict zone could transform into its most hopeful intersection. The station grew from an emergency medical outpost into a fully integrated interspecies community, complete with research laboratories, cultural exchange wings, and residential sectors where former adversaries now lived as neighbors. What began as a temporary solution to end hostilities became a permanent fixture in galactic relations, a place where multiple civilizations collaborated instead of clashed. Some traditionalists, within military and political circles, still viewed the station as a dangerously naive experiment that could collapse at any moment. They argued that placing former enemies in close proximity with minimal security protocols invited disaster. Critics predicted cultural friction, security breaches, or simple logistical failures that would prove the impossibility of sustained cooperation between species with such violent histories. They watched the station's development with skeptical anticipation, waiting for the inevitable failure that would confirm their belief in fundamental interspecies incompatibility. Instead, the station produced medical breakthroughs that benefited every species involved. Cross-species research teams developed treatments for previously incurable conditions by combining biological knowledge from multiple evolutionary paths. Vexar regenerative techniques combined with human neural mapping created revolutionary rehabilitation methods. Avian respiratory specialists working with reptilian biologists developed atmospheric adaptation technologies that helped settlements on previously uninhabitable worlds. The collaborative environment fostered innovations that isolated research efforts had failed to achieve for centuries. The station's research model proved more innovative than isolated scientific efforts because it forced specialists to explain their assumptions to colleagues from completely different biological and cultural backgrounds. This cross-pollination of ideas led to approaches that single-species research teams would never have considered. Problems were examined from multiple physiological perspectives, with solutions that worked across species boundaries rather than serving narrow interests. The station became known for elegant universal solutions rather than specialized, limited applications. Graduates of the station's training programs spread across the galaxy, carrying new perspectives on interspecies relations. Medical professionals who trained there approached their work with a cross-species ethic that previous generations lacked. Engineers incorporated universal design principles that accommodated multiple physiologies. Even military officers who passed through the station's exchange programs returned to their commands with altered attitudes about conflict resolution and preservation priorities. The station's influence radiated outward through its alumni, changing professional standards across multiple fields. The physical structure itself stood as proof that former enemies could build something valuable together. The station's architecture blended design elements from all participating species, creating spaces that felt familiar, yet new to everyone. Corridors widened to accommodate different body types, atmospheric controls maintained multiple environment settings, and communal areas encouraged interaction across species lines. The station didn't just facilitate cooperation, it embodied it in every bulkhead and control panel. It became the most successful peacekeeping initiative in recorded galactic history, not through enforcement or treaties but through continuous collaboration. The station required constant maintenance, research, and administration that kept multiple species working together daily. This ongoing practical cooperation created relationships that formal diplomacy alone could never achieve. The shared work of keeping the station operational became more binding than any signed agreement. The story of its origin, how a medic's refusal to accept traditional warfare created this unprecedented institution, became required learning across civilizations. Military academies taught it as a case study in alternative conflict resolution. Medical schools included it in ethics curricula. Diplomatic training programs used it to demonstrate how practical cooperation could achieve what negotiation alone could not. The station's history became a standard reference point for anyone studying interspecies relations, proof that sometimes the most lasting peace comes from building something together, rather than destroying each other separately. So psychologists across multiple species began analyzing why Danny's medical approach worked. where centuries of violence had consistently failed. They formed interdisciplinary teams combining neural researchers, cultural anthropologists, and military strategists to study the psychological impact of receiving uncompromising care from a supposed enemy. Their findings revealed something traditional warfare had never accounted for: the human medical ethic created psychological effects that weapons simply couldn't achieve. The Vexar cultural framework had no preparation for unconditional compassion from adversaries. Their military training emphasized aggression, honor through combat, and viewing enemies as inferior beings. They'd been psychologically conditioned to expect hostility, deception, or surrender attempts, not professional medical care delivered with clinical detachment. This created immediate cognitive dissonance that disrupted their combat programming. Soldiers found themselves experiencing gratitude toward those they were supposed to hate, creating neural pathways that conflicted with their conditioning. The absence of expected aggression caused genuine psychological disorientation. Where their training had prepared them for violent resistance, they encountered calm professionalism. Where they anticipated threats, they received medical assistance. This mismatch between expectation and reality created what psychologists termed tactical confusion, a mental state where standard combat responses became inappropriate or ineffective. The soldiers' training offered no protocols for dealing with enemies who treated their wounds and offered nutritional supplements. Gratitude itself became a psychological weapon more effective than any physical armament. The brain's response to receiving aid, particularly in vulnerable states, created emotional bonds that contradicted hostility programming. Neural imaging showed that regions associated with trust and social bonding activated when soldiers received medical care, while areas linked to aggression showed decreased activity. The very act of accepting help created psychological shifts that made returning to combat feel like a violation of basic reciprocity principles. The predictability of violence was completely replaced by the unpredictability of care. Military strategists realized that while soldiers could be trained to respond to countless combat scenarios, they had no preparation for systematic compassion. Weapons fire followed predictable patterns: attack, counterattack, defense. Medical assistance followed an entirely different logic based on need assessment and treatment priority. This unpredictability made traditional tactical planning useless against an approach that didn't conform to warfare's established rules. Medical care became recognized as the ultimate psychological warfare tool, not through manipulation but through genuine human compassion. It achieved what violence never could. It made former enemies see each other as beings worthy of preservation. The psychological impact extended beyond individual soldiers to entire command structures, making continued aggression feel not just strategically unwise, but morally inconsistent with their own received treatment. This understanding would transform galactic conflict resolution for centuries. Military psychologists began developing what they called compassion-based deterrence strategies. Training programs incorporated psychological preparation for receiving aid from enemies. The realization that care could achieve what weapons couldn't led to a complete reevaluation of psychological warfare principles. The galaxy had discovered that sometimes the most powerful weapon was a well-stocked medical kit and the willingness to use it on anyone who needed help, regardless of which side they fought for. Then the Galactic Council faced the practical challenge of implementing what everyone was calling the Murphy Protocol, a complete overhaul of conflict engagement that made traditional military planners genuinely uncomfortable. They formed specialized committees combining medical experts, psychologists, and tactical officers to develop standardized procedures for what they termed compassion-based engagement. The protocols looked nothing like traditional combat manuals, reading more like medical emergency response guidelines mixed with diplomatic communication protocols. Traditional military leaders resisted what they dismissively called the medicalization of warfare. Veteran commanders argued that inserting medical assessments into combat situations would create dangerous delays and operational vulnerabilities. They viewed the protocols as dangerously naive, claiming that pausing to evaluate enemy health status during engagements would get their own personnel killed. The debate raged through command structures, with traditionalists clinging to centuries of established doctrine while reformers pointed to the undeniable results of the Vexar conflict. The protocol's core requirement, Medical assessment before weapons deployment became the most contentious point. It mandated that all initial contact with potential threats include basic health scans and medical status evaluations. Commanders had to determine if hostile actions might stem from correctable physiological conditions before authorizing defensive measures. This represented a complete inversion of standard engagement principles where threat identification immediately triggered defensive preparations. Officers found themselves studying metabolic charts alongside tactical displays, learning to recognize nutritional deficiency patterns that might explain aggressive behavior. Combat training expanded to include extensive medical and psychological components that many career soldiers found baffling. War simulations now included medical triage scenarios alongside tactical exercises. Soldiers learned to apply emergency medical treatment to wounded enemies as part of standard engagement protocols. The training shifted from purely destructive skills to a balance of preservation and defensive capabilities. Military academies that had focused on marksmanship and tactical planning now required courses in cross-species anatomy and emergency medical response. Diplomatic corps underwent similar transformations, integrating medical personnel directly into negotiation teams. Where diplomats previously arrived with security details and cultural advisors, they now brought medical specialists who could assess the physiological state of negotiating partners. Diplomatic meetings began with health assessments and medical scans, creating entirely new opening protocols that often disarmed tense situations before they could escalate. The presence of medical professionals changed the tone of negotiations from confrontational to collaborative. The very definition of military victory shifted from enemy destruction to mutual stability. Success metrics now included preservation of infrastructure, minimization of casualties on all sides, and establishment of ongoing medical cooperation. Battlefield assessments measured lives saved alongside objectives achieved, creating completely new evaluation criteria that many traditional officers struggled to understand. Promotion boards began considering medical response capabilities alongside combat performance. Despite initial resistance, the Murphy Protocol gradually became standard operating procedure across galactic forces. The practical advantages became too significant to ignore. Conflicts resolved through medical intervention cost fewer resources, created better long-term outcomes, and often led to valuable interspecies collaborations. Traditional military leaders found themselves adapting to the new reality, learning to think like medics while planning like strategists. This represented the most significant shift in military doctrine in centuries, fundamentally altering how civilized species approached conflict. The protocols created a framework where preservation became the primary objective, and destruction became the last resort. The galaxy had discovered that sometimes the strongest tactical position involved offering medical assistance rather than deploying weapons, and this realization would shape interstellar relations for generations without a single shot being fired in anger. Then Corporal Danny Murphy's reputation solidified into something nobody in the Galactic Council could have anticipated. By every traditional military metric, he remained exactly what they'd requested: Earth's weakest active soldier. Still 0 confirmed kills, still no combat experience, still carrying that medical kit instead of a weapon. His service record showed the same blank spaces where combat achievements should have been listed. Yet across the galaxy, he became known as their strongest and most reliable ally, the one person multiple civilizations would trust with their most vulnerable moments. This paradoxical identity forged a completely new cosmic standard. Where military strength had once meant destructive capacity and tactical dominance, it now included preservation capability and medical readiness. The galaxy began measuring security not by how many enemies a civilization could eliminate, but by how many lives it could protect across species lines. Medical care, cross-species cooperation, and compassionate problem-solving shifted from auxiliary considerations to primary instruments of interstellar security. Defense budgets started allocating funds to mobile surgical units alongside weapons development programs. The story of the medic who refused to let anyone die, friend, foe, or civilian, spread through galactic networks until it achieved legendary status. It wasn't just a military anecdote anymore. It became cultural currency, told in training academies, diplomatic meetings, and even entertainment broadcasts. His simple quotes about medical ethics and patient care became standard training material across species. Every life deserves preservation, found its way into tactical manuals. Compassion as strategic advantage became a core principle in military academies that had previously taught overwhelming force as the only solution. The so-called Murphy doctrine of care-first engagement gradually replaced numerous tactical manuals that had governed interstellar conflict for centuries. Where previous doctrines emphasized escalation dominance and destructive capability, his approach prioritized de-escalation through medical assistance and preservation of all life. Military strategists found that offering medical aid during conflicts created psychological advantages that weapons never achieved. The doctrine didn't eliminate combat, it just made it the last option rather than the first response. This single medic's stubborn refusal to escalate conflict, to treat enemies as patients, to value preservation over destruction, fundamentally altered interstellar relations forever. Diplomatic channels that had been frozen for decades reopened with medical collaboration as their foundation. Trade agreements grew from medical supply exchanges. Cultural understanding developed through shared medical training programs. The approach became humanity's most unexpected and hopeful export to the galaxy. Not a weapon system or military strategy, but a philosophical framework that treated all life as worth saving. His legacy wasn't in monuments or victory celebrations, but in operating rooms and medical stations across civilized space. Young medical professionals from multiple species now studied his methods alongside traditional medical training. Military officers learned to assess medical capabilities with the same seriousness they once reserved for weapons systems. The galactic community had discovered that sometimes the strongest position wasn't having the biggest gun, but having the best medical response team. And that realization would shape interspecies relations for generations to come, without a single shot being fired. You know how war economies traditionally measure success by comparing resources expended against damage inflicted on the enemy. The Galactic Council's analyst conducted a comprehensive after-action review of the entire Vexar conflict, expecting to document the costs of weapons expenditure, ship losses, and combat operations. Instead, they uncovered something that made their traditional economic model suddenly look outdated and inefficient. Danny's medical approach wasn't just morally admirable, it was staggeringly cost-effective in ways their defense budgets had never considered. Medical supplies turned out to cost a fraction of equivalent weapon systems. Where a single plasma torpedo required rare minerals and complex manufacturing, a complete field medical kit used commonly available compounds and simple fabrication processes. Training programs showed similar disparities. Educating a combat specialist involved expensive simulations, live fire exercises, and years of tactical training, while medic training focused on practical skills with lower infrastructure costs. The preservation of infrastructure provided the most dramatic economic contrast. Traditional combat damaged or destroyed ships, stations, and planetary facilities that required massive reconstruction budgets. Medical interventions left everything intact and operational. Interspecies collaboration created unexpected economic benefits that hadn't been part of any pre-war planning. Former adversaries began sharing technology and research, opening trade routes that had been closed for decades. Medical cooperation led to joint research initiatives that accelerated technological development in multiple fields. The economic advantages of cooperation began outpacing the perceived benefits of conquest almost immediately. Where territorial gains had previously meant resource extraction and occupation costs, medical collaboration created self-sustaining economic relationships that benefited all participants. The cost-benefit analysis became unmistakably clear when presented to the Council's Budget Committee. Every credit spent on medical preparedness returned multiple credits in preserved infrastructure, maintained productivity, and new economic opportunities. Weapons expenditures showed the opposite pattern. Resources consumed for temporary tactical advantages that often required additional spending to address resulting damage. The committee found themselves looking at spreadsheets where the most aggressive military campaigns showed negative economic returns while medical initiatives demonstrated consistent positive outcomes. Budget allocations underwent the most dramatic shift in galactic military history. Weapons research departments found their funding reduced or redirected toward medical innovation. Ships designed for combat were retrofitted with enhanced medical facilities. Training programs incorporated cross-species medical training into core curricula. The economic reality had fundamentally changed. Preservation produced better returns than destruction. Collaboration created more value than conquest, and medical readiness provided better security than weapon superiority. Not fighting proved to be the most economically sound military strategy ever documented. The Council's economists calculated that the medical approach had saved more resources in 6 months than the entire military budget for the previous fiscal year. They weren't just measuring saved lives anymore. They were measuring saved credits, preserved infrastructure, and new economic opportunities that wouldn't have existed under continued conflict. The economic argument became so compelling that even the most traditional military advisors couldn't dispute the numbers. The galaxy had discovered that sometimes the most strategic move was also the most economical, and that realization would reshape defense spending for generations. You know how most war stories end with memorials and monuments to the fallen. This one ended with a fully accredited medical school operating where torpedo launchers used to be. Within 6 months of the ceasefire, the former combat zone underwent a transformation that made traditional military planners genuinely uncomfortable. The coordinates that had previously been designated as Engagement Sector Theta 7 now hosted the galaxy's first fully integrated interspecies medical station, a facility that treated patients instead of targeting enemy vessels. Admiral Krelnox and his command staff, veterans of multiple campaigns, found themselves presiding over something that looked nothing like a military installation. Their tactical displays now showed patient flowcharts instead of combat readiness reports. Their communications channels carried medical data instead of engagement statuses. Officers who could previously calculate torpedo trajectories in their sleep now had to learn triage protocols and medical supply logistics. The philosophical shift was so complete it left some senior staff feeling like they'd woken up in an alternate reality where everything made sense, except their own job descriptions. Engineers from both civilizations worked side by station, integrating Vexar bioregeneration technology with human emergency medical systems. The resulting hybrid medical bay could treat over 30 different species simultaneously, with environmental controls that could shift atmospheric conditions to suit patient needs. What had been weapons calibration stations became diagnostic centers, with scanning equipment far more sophisticated than the targeting systems they replaced. The station's structural framework, originally designed for combat durability, now supported surgical suites and recovery wards instead of armories. They named it Second Chance Station, partly after Danny's persistent philosophy that everyone deserved medical care regardless of species or affiliation. The name stuck despite some initial resistance from traditionalists who thought it sounded insufficiently martial. Former enemies became colleagues in medical research, sharing data on species-specific physiologies and collaborative treatment approaches. Vexar surgeons learned human microsurgery techniques, while human doctors incorporated Vexar neural regeneration methods. The exchange of medical knowledge created professional relationships that diplomatic efforts had failed to establish for decades. Diplomatic exchanges grew naturally from the medical collaboration. What began as shared training programs for emergency medical technicians evolved into cultural exchange initiatives and eventually formal diplomatic channels. Military personnel who had been trained for combat found themselves learning cross-species anatomy and medical ethics. The station's corridors filled with personnel from multiple civilizations wearing medical uniforms instead of combat armor, carrying diagnostic equipment instead of weapons. Healthcare, not conquest, became the driving organizational principle of interstellar relations in that sector. The station's success led to similar facilities being established in other previously contested regions. The galactic community watched with a mixture of skepticism and fascination as the most violent conflict zone in recent memory transformed into the most advanced medical research hub in the quadrant. Traditional military leaders struggled with the new paradigm while medical professionals found themselves with unprecedented influence and resources. The galaxy had never seen peace achieved through medical collaboration on this scale. Previous conflicts had ended with treaties, surrenders, or mutual exhaustion, but never with the complete reorientation of resources from destruction to preservation. The station stood as physical proof that former enemies could build something more valuable together than they could ever take from each other through force. Its success challenged centuries of military doctrine and established healthcare as a legitimate strategic framework for interstellar relations. The transition was so complete that new personnel arriving at the station often couldn't identify which sections had originally been designed for combat operations and which had been added later for medical purposes. So the Galactic Council found itself in the unusual position of having to reconsider 4 centuries of military doctrine. Their experiment with Earth's weakest soldier had concluded with the conflict ending entirely, 0 additional casualties on either side, and the establishment of an interspecies medical station where there used to be a battlefield. Traditional military assessment criteria simply didn't have categories for this outcome. Victory was supposed to involve territory gained, enemies eliminated, resources secured, not former opponents collaborating on medical, research and sharing patient care protocols. They gradually came to understand that Earth's refusal to prioritize killing wasn't a weakness, but a highly advanced form of strategic thinking. While other civilizations measured military strength and destructive capacity, humans had quietly developed preservation as a tactical advantage. Danny's cheerful refrain about being in surgery or in the middle of a procedure became symbolic of this approach, a constant reminder that some objectives could be achieved without inflicting harm. His medical duties weren't aside from the mission, they were the mission itself. Heroism underwent a complete redefinition across galactic military forces. Where combat kills had previously been the primary metric for valor and promotion, saves and successful medical interventions became equally valued. Medals that once recognized exceptional destruction now celebrated exceptional preservation. The medic's discipline shifted from auxiliary support to primary strategic specialization, with medical readiness considered as critical as combat readiness. Military academies that had taught overwhelming force as the solution to every problem began incorporating medical ethics and cross-species care into their core. Curricula galactic security frameworks expanded to include medical preparedness as a primary defense strategy. Fleet assessments now evaluated medical capabilities alongside weapon systems, with ships graded on their capacity to render aid as well as inflict damage. The Council's Strategic Planning Division established entire departments dedicated to medical diplomacy and humanitarian intervention as conflict resolution tools. Budget allocations reflected this shift, with significant resources moving from weapons research to medical innovation. Weakness became wisdom when applied with uncompromising ethical consistency. What the Council had initially dismissed as Earth's military deficiency revealed itself as sophisticated strategic thinking that simply operated on a different value system. The human approach treated every life as worth preserving, every injury as worth treating, every conflict as an opportunity for healing rather than destruction. This perspective, which seemed naive initially, proved more effective at securing lasting peace than any weapon system ever developed. The story of the medic who ended a war without firing a shot became a central narrative that would captivate military strategists and historians for generations. It wasn't just an interesting anecdote. It represented a complete paradigm shift in how civilizations might approach conflict. Military theorists would study the Murphy approach alongside traditional combat doctrines, analyzing how preservation could create advantages that destruction never achieved. The concept of victory through healing entered the galactic lexicon, challenging centuries of assumptions about power and security. New officers would learn about the conflict not as a case study in tactical brilliance, but as an example of philosophical reorientation. The lessons weren't about better weapons or smarter battle plans, but about different ways to define objectives and measure success. The story preserved its central hook, the unexpected effectiveness of compassion in military contexts, while providing a template for entirely new approaches to interstellar relations. The galaxy had discovered that sometimes the strongest move was refusing to fight at all, and that realization would echo through military academies and command centers for centuries to come. So Danny returned to the Retribution with the kind of battlefield intelligence that didn't fit any existing reporting categories. He stood before the command staff in the briefing room, still wearing his medical patches and carrying that same trauma kit, while admirals and tactical officers waited for combat assessments or enemy weakness analysis. Instead, he reported 200 confirmed saves with the straightforward delivery of someone reading supply inventory. The command staff processed this number with expressions ranging from confusion to disbelief. Saves weren't a standard metric in their tactical evaluations. Then, He dropped the statistical anomaly that would redefine their understanding of warfare. Approximately 60 of those saves, he mentioned casually, were Vexar combatants. The room went completely silent except for the hum of the ship's systems. Officers exchanged glances, checking if they'd heard correctly. He'd provided medical assistance to enemy soldiers during active combat operations, and he was reporting this as a tactical achievement rather than a security breach. He explained that the treated Vexar soldiers had exhibited what he called treatment-based deterrence. Once they'd received medical care from human personnel, they consistently refused to engage him or his medical teams in subsequent combat encounters. It wasn't loyalty or defection. It was a simple psychological refusal to harm those who had shown them compassion during vulnerability. The enemy soldiers would either disengage from combat entirely or actively avoid, targeting medical personnel and their patients. Saving lives had become a strategic weapon more effective than any plasma rifle or torpedo system. The traditional calculus of war, where victory was measured in enemy casualties and territory gained, completely inverted itself in that briefing room. Command staff who had spent their careers studying kill ratios and destruction metrics now faced a paradigm where preservation created tactical advantages that destruction never could. They struggled to comprehend warfare where healing damaged enemy morale more effectively than harming their personnel. Danny declared himself an equal opportunity lifesaver, without a trace of irony. As if this were the most natural military specialization in the galaxy, he presented medical assistance as a form of psychological operations that fundamentally altered enemy combat behavior. Where traditional weapons created fear and aggression, medical care created cognitive dissonance and moral hesitation. The Vexar military mindset had no preparation for enemies who treated their wounded with professional competence and compassion. The Medical Corps, previously considered auxiliary support personnel, suddenly became the most effective combat unit aboard the vessel. Their non-lethal interventions produced tactical advantages that lasted beyond individual engagements, creating lasting behavioral changes in enemy combatants. Officers began reviewing engagement reports with new understanding, recognizing patterns where medical interventions had created strategic opportunities that weapons fire never could. This revelation would lead to the most audacious and unconventional plan of the entire conflict. Tactical planners who had been designing destruction scenarios now found themselves contemplating medical deployment strategies. The conversation shifted from how many ships they could disable to how many personnel they could treat. Weapons officers started asking questions about medical supply logistics instead of ammunition reserves. The entire framework of the conflict had been quietly dismantled and reassembled around a completely different set of principles, all because one medic had treated enemies instead of killing them and reported the results as tactical intelligence. Then Danny proposed the most tactically insane idea the Galactic Council had ever reviewed. Instead of destroying the Vexar fleet, they would systematically improve its health. He stood before the Strategic Planning Committee with medical charts instead of tactical maps, arguing that crew wellness directly influenced combat decision-making. Healthy soldiers made rational choices, he explained, while malnourished, exhausted, or stressed personnel tended toward aggression and poor judgment. The proposal suggested medical intervention as a form of nonviolent disarmament, where improving enemy readiness would actually reduce their combat effectiveness by restoring logical thinking. The Galactic Council's initial response ranged from disbelief to outright dismissal. Senior admirals called it dangerously naive. Tactical analysts questioned its strategic viability, and political advisors warned about the propaganda implications of helping an enemy force. This was the kind of idea that would have been laughed out of any military academy, sending medical assistance to opponents actively trying to destroy you. They'd spent centuries developing weapon systems, and now this human medic wanted to send vitamin supplements and diagnostic equipment instead of torpedoes. Murphy responded with comparative data from multiple species showing consistent correlations between physiological stress and combat aggression. He presented findings indicating that well-rested, properly nourished soldiers across 17 different civilizations showed significantly reduced engagement frequencies in simulated combat scenarios. The statistics suggested that healthier crews tended to prioritize preservation over destruction when given tactical choices. He wasn't arguing from morality but from observable, repeatable data patterns that applied across biological frameworks. His operational plan involved deploying medical shuttles instead of attack fighters, sending teams with diagnostic equipment rather than weapons, and establishing cross-species medical stations at neutral coordinates. The approach treated the entire conflict as a public health crisis rather than a military engagement, with combat operations framed as symptoms of underlying physiological conditions rather than strategic choices. Commander Zarok, still processing his own medical evaluation aboard the Retribution, surprised everyone by agreeing to the experiment. The Vexar warlord had been monitoring his own crew's health indicators since Murphy's visit and had noticed patterns that aligned with the humans' claims. His decision wasn't based on trust or diplomacy, but on tactical assessment. The data suggested this approach might achieve their objectives with significantly reduced casualties on both sides. The entire Vexar fleet stood down under what was officially termed emergency medical evaluation protocols. Combat operations ceased as medical teams from both sides began collaborative health assessments. Human and Vexar medics worked side by side treating injuries, nutritional deficiencies, and stress-related conditions that had been ignored during extended combat operations. The shift from hostility to collaboration happened with startling speed once medical professionals began exchanging data and treatment methodologies. What had been a battlefield transformed into a massive, collaborative medical facility within hours. Ships that had been targeting each other now exchanged medical supplies instead of weapons fire. Communication channels that had carried threats and tactical data now transmitted patient information and treatment protocols. The entire engagement zone became a temporary hospital where the only shooting involved hyposprays and the only explosions were contained in sterilizer units. Combat operations didn't just pause, they were completely replaced by medical operations that expanded to encompass both fleets. The resolution arrived without formal surrender or victory declarations, just a gradual recognition that treating each other's medical needs created more strategic advantage than trying to destroy each other's capabilities. The battlefield had become a clinic, and the weapons had been replaced by medical scanners, creating the most unconventional ceasefire in galactic history. Then Danny did something that made the entire command staff question whether they'd misunderstood the definition of warfare itself. While tactical officers were planning precision strikes against the Vexar flagship's weapons arrays, and engineering teams were preparing boarding parties with full combat gear, Corporal Murphy was quietly loading a medical shuttle with sterilization units, surgical kits, and portable diagnostic equipment. He wasn't arming himself or preparing for combat. He was stocking what amounted to a mobile emergency room. He requested a direct communication channel to the Vexar command vessel, which the communications officer provided with visible reluctance. Everyone expected some kind of psychological warfare tactic, perhaps a surrender demand or strategic threat. Instead, Murphy opened with a polite request for medical boarding permission. "This is Corporal Danny Murphy of the Earth Medical Corps," he said with that same infuriatingly calm tone. "I'm observing significant casualty indicators from your vessel's energy signatures and would like to offer medical assistance to any wounded crew members." His transmission specifically mentioned advanced surgical supplies, multi-species compatible pain medications, and what he described as a really impressive portable X-ray machine with cross-species anatomical mapping capabilities, and he listed these items with the same enthusiasm. Another soldier might describe weapon systems, detailing scan resolutions and treatment efficacy rates rather than destructive potential. The Vexar command deck fell into complete silence. Officers looked at each other with expressions of pure cognitive dissonance. Their tactical displays showed an enemy warship. Their weapons were charged and ready. Their boarding parties were prepared, and they were receiving a medical assistance offer from what sounded like an interstellar paramedic. They'd trained for hostile transmissions, for surrender demands, for tactical negotiations. This was something entirely outside their operational parameters. Commander Zarok, a veteran of 37 combat engagements across 6 systems, found himself staring at the communication panel as if it had malfunctioned. Every instinct and every tactical manual dictated immediate termination of the absurd transmission. But something about the human's tone, the complete lack of hostility, the professional earnestness, the specific medical terminology, made the offer seem bizarrely genuine rather than strategically insane. It was the conversational equivalent of a doctor calling to reschedule an appointment during a bank robbery. The commander faced a decision that no warfare protocol had ever anticipated. His first officer recommended treating it as a psychological operation and terminating communications. His tactical officer suggested tracing the signal for targeting data, but Zarok had watched the earlier engagement reports, including the footage of his own boarding party receiving medical treatment instead of combat resistance. He'd seen the human medic's approach firsthand through those security recordings, against all standard protocol, against the advice of his senior staff, and against centuries of military tradition. Commander Zarok granted medical boarding permission. He specified strict conditions. The shuttle would be escorted by combat craft, the human would be thoroughly scanned for weapons, and the operation would be terminated at any sign of threat. But the permission was granted. The channel closed to absolute silence on both vessels. This decision would become the catalyst that transformed the entire conflict. While tactical teams on both sides watched with weapons ready and targeting systems active, a single medical shuttle detached from the Retribution and began its approach toward the enemy flagship. It carried no weapons, no combat personnel, no strategic devices, just one cheerful medic and enough medical supplies to treat approximately 200 patients. The trajectory it followed would eventually be studied as the moment galactic warfare changed forever. You know how most interspecies first contact situations involve weapon scans and security protocols. This one started with blood pressure cuffs and metabolic rate assessments. Corporal Murphy moved through the Vexar Dreadnought's corridors with his medical scanner active, treating wounded crew members with the same professional detachment he'd shown aboard the Retribution. The Vexar soldiers watched with a mixture of suspicion and fascination as this human medic worked, their weapons still in hand but their aggression momentarily suspended by sheer bewilderment at the situation. Commander Zarok observed from the command platform, his combat-hardened features showing the first cracks in decades of military certainty. The veteran warlord had expected interrogation, negotiation, or combat, not a medical consultation. Murphy finished treating a bridge officer's plasma burn, then approached the command station with his scanner still humming. "Commander," he said with that infuriatingly calm tone, "I couldn't help but notice your stress indicators are reading at concerning levels. Would you mind if I performed a quick diagnostic? Unhealthy commanders tend to make suboptimal decisions under pressure." Zarok's officers bristled at the implied criticism, but the commander himself remained still, his tactical mind processing this bizarre development. Murphy didn't wait for permission, just began scanning while discussing cortisol levels and their impact on strategic thinking. Elevated stress hormones impair cognitive function by approximately 23% in most species, he remarked conversationally. Your command decisions are literally being compromised by physiological factors you've probably been taught to ignore. He moved on to vitamin deficiencies, pointing out how certain nutritional shortages common in extended combat operations affected reaction times and judgment. The conversation shifted from weapons ranges and tactical advantages to metabolic rates and neural efficiency. Medical terminology became the common language where military strategy had consistently failed, where diplomatic overtures had been met with suspicion and tactical discussions with counter-strategies. Medical observations were simply accepted as factual information. Zarok found himself listening with growing interest as Murphy explained how crew health directly correlated with operational effectiveness. The human medic presented data showing that well-rested, properly nourished soldiers made fewer tactical errors, maintained better discipline, and showed improved situational awareness. He discussed sleep cycles as strategic assets, nutrition as combat readiness, and medical readiness as tactical advantage. The Vexar commander began seeing his crew not as disposable resources but as valuable assets whose maintenance directly impacted mission success. Data-driven, health observations suddenly became more valuable than combat intelligence. Murphy shared cross-species medical data that showed consistent patterns. Healthy civilizations rarely started conflicts, while nutritionally deficient populations showed increased aggression patterns. He presented medical facts with the same weight another officer might give enemy movement reports, and the tactical staff found themselves taking notes on metabolic health rather than weapon specifications. 2. Civilizations that had been trying to destroy each other. for months suddenly found common ground in the universal principles of care and preservation. The conversation on the command deck shifted from destruction to maintenance, from elimination to optimization. Officers who had been planning attack vectors were now discussing nutritional supply chains and medical resource allocation. The language of warfare was being quietly replaced by the vocabulary of healthcare, and nobody quite knew how it had happened except that the human medic kept presenting medical facts as if they were the most obvious things in the universe. The resolution arrived without ceremony or dramatic announcement. Commander Zarok ordered his tactical officers to stand down from combat readiness and began asking questions about cross-species medical compatibility. The shift was so gradual and logical that it barely registered as a surrender or negotiation, just a practical adjustment based on new data. The conversation had permanently shifted from how to destroy each other to how to maintain each other, and nobody on that command deck could quite remember when the change had occurred. Then the hull breach alarm sounded with that particular urgency that normally triggers abandoned ship protocols throughout the fleet, not the standard battle damage alert, but the specific triple frequency tone that means catastrophic structural failure and imminent atmospheric evacuation. A Vexar torpedo had torn a 6-meter gash in the Retribution's port side, creating a breach that threatened to vacuum the entire forward section into space within minutes. Emergency seals had failed, containment fields were fluctuating, and standard procedure dictated immediate evacuation of 12 adjacent compartments. Instead of initiating evacuation, Corporal Murphy announced they were going to treat this breach. He said it with the same calm tone a surgeon might use to discuss a routine appendectomy. While battle-hardened warriors braced for emergency protocols, Murphy was already moving toward the damaged section with his medical kit. Assessing the situation not as a structural emergency, but as a medical condition requiring immediate intervention, he approached the screeching, atmosphere-sucking tear in the hull with the same clinical detachment he'd use on a bleeding wound. The howling wind of escaping air, the sparking conduits, the emergency lights flashing crimson, none of it seemed to register as cause for alarm, only as symptoms to be addressed. He began applying rapidly expanding medical sealants along the edges of the breach, using the same pressurized applicators normally employed for emergency wound closure on living patients. The foam-like substance hardened almost instantly against the torn metal, creating temporary seals that slowed the atmosphere loss. Then he used a surgical laser, designed for precision tissue cutting, to carefully trim away jagged metal edges around the breach. Engineering staff watched in disbelief as medical equipment was repurposed for structural repair. He worked with methodical precision, prioritizing what he called stopping the bleeding over conventional damage control procedures. While engineers would have focused on power containment and structural reinforcement, Murphy treated atmosphere loss as the primary symptom, directing crew members to apply additional sealants at specific intervals like applying pressure to a wound. He diagnosed the ship's injuries with medical terminology, referring to sparking power conduits as neurological, damage and compromised structural members as musculoskeletal trauma. His approach created a completely different repair priority system that focused on preserving life support first, structural integrity second, and weapons systems a distant third. Engineering teams found themselves following medical analogies rather than technical manuals, applying treatments designed for biological systems to mechanical ones. The breach was sealed using techniques never before documented in naval combat manuals. Instead of standard emergency plating and welding, the repair involved layered medical-grade sealants, precisely trimmed edges using surgical tools, and a priority system that treated atmosphere preservation as the critical factor. Engineering teams watched with reluctant admiration as methods developed for emergency medicine proved astonishingly effective for starship damage control, but the real test came just as the last sealant hardened. New alerts flashed across the bridge displays. Not structural damage this time, but boarding party detections. While they'd been treating the ship's injuries, Vexar assault teams had used the distraction to breach intact sections of the vessel. The medical team now faced armed combatants instead of structural damage, and Corporal Murphy's approach was about to face its most unconventional test yet. So the Vexar boarding party came through the breached airlock exactly like they'd trained. Weapons raised, combat stances perfect, expecting immediate resistance. They were prepared for defensive positions, return fire, maybe even hand-to-hand combat. Standard boarding protocol for a warship full of enemy combatants. What they found was Corporal Danny Murphy standing calmly beside a med cart, holding a diagnostic scanner instead of a weapon, wearing that same mildly concerned expression he'd had while checking crew members' blood pressure earlier. "Good evening. Gentlemen," he said with polite formality, as if greeting dinner guests rather than armed invaders. "I couldn't help but notice several of you have sustained injuries during your entry procedure." He gestured with the scanner toward a soldier whose armor showed fresh plasma scoring along one arm. "That burn looks like it reached third-degree penetration. Would you mind if I applied a cooling gel? Infection risk increases significantly with Vexar plasma weapons. Something about the residual energy signatures." The lead soldier hesitated, his weapon still raised but his stance shifting from aggressive to confused. This wasn't in any combat manual. Murphy didn't wait for permission, just moved forward with medical supplies while continuing to talk about battlefield hygiene practices. "The problem with most armor systems," he explained while applying a blue-tinged gel to the soldier's arm, "is they prioritize impact resistance over medical accessibility. Makes treating injuries unnecessarily complicated." He bandaged the wound with efficient movements, his attention entirely on the medical procedure rather than the weapon still pointed in his general direction. Other boarding party members watched with growing uncertainty. They'd trained for violent resistance, for tactical challenges, for overwhelming force responses. Nobody had prepared them for professional medical care delivered by the enemy mid-invasion. Murphy moved to the next soldier, noting a leg injury from the forced entry. "Ligament damage by the look of that stance," he commented while pulling out a stabilization brace. "Your armor's kinetic redistribution systems need recalibration. They're transferring too much. Shock to the musculoskeletal structure." He showed complete, clinical detachment toward species that their propaganda had taught them viewed humans as vermin. There was no fear, no aggression, just professional medical assessment and treatment. He discussed their own weapon systems' medical implications with technical precision, pointing out design flaws that increased injury risks to the users. The boarding party's weapons gradually lowered, not as a surrender but as a collective expression of pure cognitive dissonance. They'd come prepared for combat and found themselves participating in an impromptu medical clinic. Murphy finished treating the visible injuries among the boarding party, then offered nutrient supplements from his medkit. "Your metabolic rates suggest you've been on extended combat alert," he noted. "These will help maintain cognitive function." The soldiers accepted the packets with the confused air of people who'd expected to be fighting, not receiving health care. He disarmed them not through superior force or tactical brilliance, but through uncompromising professional medical care delivered with utter sincerity. The boarding party stood there holding nutrient packets and medical supplies instead of weapons, their combat programming completely derailed by an approach that simply didn't register as hostile. Security teams arrived to find the supposed invaders, receiving medical treatment and discussing armor design improvements with their head medic. This incident would be replayed in security briefings across the galaxy for years, studied not as a combat engagement but as a complete paradigm shift in conflict resolution. Military analysts would puzzle over how a single medic with bandages and medical gel had neutralized an armed boarding party more effectively than any defensive system. The footage showed professional soldiers looking increasingly confused as they received medical care, their weapons forgotten, their training rendered irrelevant by something their manuals had never covered: unconditional medical assistance from the enemy. "You know how most soldiers establish territory with flags or marker beacons? Danny claimed space by setting up IV poles and sterilization fields." Within hours of his arrival, the Retribution began undergoing a quiet transformation that baffled the command staff. He started in Cargo Bay 4, which had previously stored spare torpedo casings and combat rations. Now it was becoming a trauma center with surgical tables and bioscanners, arranged in precise formations that prioritized patient flow over weapon accessibility. The ship's chief engineer nearly had a system failure when he discovered Murphy had rerouted power from the secondary weapons array to medical monitoring equipment. "It's just a temporary measure," Murphy explained cheerfully while calibrating a diagnostic bed. "The plasma cannons can operate at 80% capacity without affecting defensive capabilities. But these surgical lights require full-spectrum illumination for precise work. He presented this not as a request, but as a simple statement of operational fact, as if everyone should understand that medical needs naturally superseded combat readiness. Commanders watched from the observation deck as he installed what he called atmospherically optimized lighting, essentially mood lighting that shifted between calming blues and warm ambers. He claimed it reduced surgical stress responses by measurable percentages based on human medical studies. The engineering team complained about power drains while Murphy calmly adjusted environmental controls, arguing that a calm, focused medic could save more lives than an extra plasma charge in the weapons array. He spoke about patient outcomes and recovery rates while the military staff discussed tactical advantages and enemy movements. The ship's layout underwent a subtle but profound shift. Corridors once designed for rapid troop deployment now featured clearly marked medical evacuation routes. Storage lockers that once held ammunition crates now contained organized shelves of bandages, intravenous fluids, and emergency surgical kits. Alien crew members who had trained for combat found themselves being taught how to apply pressure dressings and stabilize fractures. They held bandages instead of ammunition, medical scanners instead of weapons. You could walk through the retribution and see the transformation happening in real time. Emergency stations now had both defensive shielding controls and trauma response kits side by side. The armory still existed, but it shared wall space with automated defibrillator stations. The warship was becoming something entirely new, a hospital that happened to have engines and weapons attached. The military command structure watched this happen with a mixture of confusion and reluctant acceptance because, frankly, nobody had prepared regulations for dealing with a medic who treated the ship itself as his patient. Then the first battle alarm sounded throughout the vessel. Red lights flashed, emergency seals engaged, and the familiar vibration of weapons charging echoed through the decks. Officers rushed to their combat stations, expecting chaos and preparing for the first real test of their new weapon. Meanwhile, down in Cargo Bay 4, Corporal Murphy simply adjusted his surgical mask, checked that his instruments were properly sterilized, and nodded to the suddenly very nervous-looking medical assistants who had been training with him. His unorthodox preparations were about to face their first real examination under fire. So the battle alarm sounded and everyone reached for weapons except Danny, who started organizing what looked like a wellness retreat in the middle of the chaos. Plasma fire rattled the hull, emergency lights flashed crimson, and the ship shuddered from nearby explosions, while Corporal Murphy calmly gathered a dozen confused crew members near the medical bay and began leading them through breathing exercises. Deep inhalation through the nose, he instructed over the battle noise. Hold for 4 counts, then slow exhalation. This regulates your autonomic nervous system response to immediate threats. Veteran warriors watched from their combat stations with expressions ranging from disbelief to outright contempt. A 3-tour Special Forces commander scoffed loud enough to be heard over the weapons fire, muttering about human meditation nonsense while checking his plasma rifle's charge levels. These were soldiers who'd fought in a dozen systems, warriors who believed combat effectiveness meant aggression and overwhelming force, not controlled breathing patterns. Murphy simply nodded toward the skeptical commander while continuing his instructions. Combat effectiveness drops by approximately 37% when stress hormones exceed optimal levels, he mentioned conversationally, as if discussing the weather. Your body's cortisol response might feel like combat readiness, but it actually impairs decision-making and marksmanship. He demonstrated dynamic stretching routines next to a bank of tactical displays showing incoming enemy fighters, claiming the movements increased flexibility by 40% and reduced musculoskeletal injuries by 60% during emergency maneuvers. Then he started distributing nutrition, bars from his medical kit, each individually wrapped and color-coded for different species' biochemical needs. The blue ones for the reptilian crew members, green for the avian species' standard human formulation for himself. Maintaining stable blood sugar prevents cognitive fatigue during extended combat operations, he explained to a weapons officer who was trying to simultaneously program torpedo trajectories and chew the unexpectedly tasty nutrient. Officers on the command deck watched the main display with growing disbelief. Instead of the usual battle cries and aggressive posturing they expected from crew members under fire, They saw small groups practicing meditative breathing near their stations. The ship's atmosphere underwent a palpable shift. Where there should have been panic and aggressive energy, there was instead a strange, focused calm. Crew members moved with deliberate precision rather than frantic urgency. Their responses measured and efficient despite the continuing weapons fire and impact alerts. What had seemed like absurd medical interventions began revealing themselves as undeniable force multipliers. Damage control teams worked with coordinated efficiency rather than rushed desperation. Weapons operators reported improved targeting accuracy. Communications remained clear and articulate instead of devolving into shouted fragments. The medical preparations weren't replacing combat readiness. They were enhancing it through physiological optimization. Meanwhile, the damage reports started filtering in from multiple hull breaches. Sections 14 through 18 showed atmosphere loss. Deck 7 reported structural compromising near engineering, and the port weapons array had taken a direct hit that disabled 3 plasma cannons. Standard protocol would have meant panic and rushed repairs. Instead, crew members completed their breathing cycles, acknowledged the reports with calm professionalism, and moved to their assignments with what Murphy would later describe as optimal physiological readiness for emergency response. The real test of his methods was just beginning. The Galactic Council asked for Earth's weakest soldier, and they got Corporal Danny Murphy, the medic who's never fired a shot but just saved 200 lives. He walks onto the battlefield with a smile and a trauma kit, not a rifle. Now alien commanders are watching in disbelief as he treats enemy soldiers mid-combat. How does a healer end a war without throwing a punch? Stick around to see how medicine becomes the deadliest weapon in the galaxy. You know how most conflicts start with dramatic speeches and formal declarations, but this one began in the statistical analysis wing of a galactic command center. The Vexar weren't just winning, they were methodically dismantling the Galactic Council's forces system by system, and conventional strategies had produced nothing but casualty reports. Admirals had tried overwhelming force, tactical retreats, even attempted negotiations that always ended in more fighting. Every traditional playbook had been exhausted, leaving command staff staring at maps showing territory lost by the hour. Their final desperate move wasn't born from inspiration, but from statistical modeling. War planners calculated that testing Earth's military capabilities through their worst soldier would provide valuable intelligence at minimal cost. They requested Earth's weakest active combatant specifically, someone they could position on the front lines, observe under fire, and lose without political consequences. To the Council's strategic minds, this wasn't about finding a hero. It was about gathering data points on human performance under extreme duress. The alien commanders expected someone physically diminished, perhaps psychologically broken, the kind of soldier who'd crack under pressure and confirm their theories about human fragility. They prepared observation decks lined with sensors and recording equipment instead of honor guards. The reception committee consisted of tactical analysts with data pads, not ceremonial officers with flags. Everyone from the admiral down to the junior technicians viewed this human as expendable, a walking laboratory experiment that would probably last about 17 minutes in active combat. What they didn't account for was Earth's particular interpretation of weakest. While the Council defined weakness as poor combat performance, human military culture had developed alternative metrics. Their selection process focused on psychological profiles rather than physical capabilities, on philosophical approaches rather than kill counts. The transport shuttle approaching carried their data point all right, just not the kind they were expecting. This cold calculation would become the most catastrophic miscalculation in recent galactic history. While analysts calibrated their sensors and adjusted their prediction algorithms, the shuttle's sole passenger was calmly organizing his medical supplies and humming an old Earth tune about peace and understanding. The stage was set for tragedy, just not the tragedy anyone anticipated. The hangar bay of the Retribution stood polished and silent, all gleaming metal surfaces and grim-faced warriors in full combat armor. They formed precise rows, weapons held at formal attention, watching the shuttle doors with the tense expectation of soldiers about to witness some terrible new weapon. The air hummed with suppressed energy, every officer and technician ready to document the arrival of Earth's most pathetic warrior. Then the shuttle doors slid open without ceremony. Out stepped Corporal Danny Murphy, Earth's contribution to the Galactic War effort. He wasn't wearing combat armor, just standard-issue fatigues covered in so many medical patches they looked like a quilt. Instead of a rifle, he carried a large white trauma kit with multiple compartments. His helmet featured a glowing red cross that pulsed gently in the hangar's artificial light, like some kind of emergency beacon. He removed the helmet with a quiet click, revealing an ordinary human face with a disarmingly pleasant expression. "Corporal Danny Murphy, Earth Medical Corps," he announced with cheerful formality, as if reporting for a routine assignment rather than a desperate frontline deployment. "Request permission to come aboard and assess medical readiness." The alien officers exchanged glances. Their tactical datapads remained useless in their hands. This wasn't a soldier, this was a walking medical facility. You could practically hear their thought processes stalling as they tried to reconcile this cheerful man with medical supplies with their expectations of a broken warrior. "I should mention," Murphy added conversationally as he stepped onto the deck, "I've never actually fired a weapon in combat. Or thrown a punch for that matter. 0 confirmed kills, 100% confirmed non-combatant status." He said this with the same pride another soldier might announce their kill count. His entire philosophy, he explained calmly to the stunned officers, revolved around a simple principle: preventing death rather than causing it. He viewed battlefield medicine not as auxiliary support but as primary strategy. The concept of weakest soldier apparently meant something entirely different in human military doctrine. They measured weakness by willingness to inflict harm rather than ability to withstand it. The realization settled over the hangar bay like a cold mist. They hadn't been sent a warrior to test against the Vexar. They'd been sent a medic who considered violence itself to be the failure condition. The statistical anomaly they'd requested had arrived, just not in the form their predictive models had anticipated. Then Corporal Murphy smiled warmly at the nearest officer. "Now, if you could direct me to your largest cargo bay," he said, hefting his medical kit. "I'll need to begin converting it to a proper trauma center. I noticed your atmospheric seals could use some medical-grade reinforcement, and I brought just the supplies for that." He started walking toward the interior doors as if he'd been aboard the ship for years, leaving the entire reception committee standing awkwardly with their unused weapons and confused data pads.